Good morning, everybody. Our scripture reading this morning is going to come from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, and then 6 to 9. It reads, "So now, Israel, give heed to the statutes and ordinances that I am teaching you to observe, so that you may live and enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. You must neither add anything to what I command, nor take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God with which I am charging you. You must observe them and perform them, for this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples, who when they hear all these statutes will say, 'Surely this is a great nation, is a wise and discerning people.' For what other nation has a God so near to it that the Lord God is whenever we call to him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this entire law that I am setting before you today? But take care and watch yourselves closely, so as neither to forget the things that your eyes have seen, nor let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. May God add a blessing to the reading, to the hearing, and the living of His holy word. Thanks be to God." At least in my Bible, and I have a New Revised Standard Version, United Methodist, little branded Bible here. At the top, have you ever seen when they try to title the verses? And many times I do find them generally unhelpful, because any time that those titles sometimes mislead you as to what the section's actually about, or don't even have the sections broken apart right. But that's a whole other topic for another day. But in this time, I found it very helpful. The title, at least on my section, was God's Law, Sign of a Great Nation. And it got me thinking about, in reading our Old Testament lectionary text, how, we are at this point in American politics, and I'm sorry I'm going there, friends, in American politics where we seem to have two very competing views of what makes our nation great. And in Deuteronomy 4, 1 to 2, and then 6 to 9, we get this reading in the lectionary, God's law as a sign of a great nation. And God Himself seems to indicate what not only His blessing upon the law that's being established, but that if God's laws follows, people from all over the world, neighboring nations, would look and say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning nation. And what other great nation, statutes and ordinances are as just as this entire law that I'm setting before you today? As if to say, the heart of God's law is the truth that that He is asking His people to live by. And if they do that, this is the way of love, and that this is the way of peace, and that we shouldn't let anything that God has done from us slip from our minds, as it says, all the days of our life. And we should make known this law to our children and our children's children. Now, an interesting thing also coming up amidst this election, when we are having this debate about what truly makes our country here in the United States great, is recently many states have voted to put the 10 Commandments on the wall of schools and mandated that these things be taught. Maybe even through a misguided sense of, here we find in verse 9, and that we should make them known to our children and our children's children. And we shouldn't add anything to it, and we shouldn't take away from it. And I think the argument about putting these 10 Commandments within the public school systems was that our country's laws were somehow founded on the basic of God's law, of these 10 Commandments issued by Moses on the top of Mount Sinai. Little note on that. In the New Testament, especially in Matthew, we find Jesus also escape to Egypt, come back, go up onto a mount, and issue His Sermon on the Mount, which you could frame as an exposition upon God's law. Not adding to it, not taking away from it, but striking to the very heart of it. And that all the precepts in the law set up in Deuteronomy that say an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, Jesus is going to come around and say, yeah, well, though you have heard it said, I'm going to tell you to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And instead of just not coveting your neighbor's wife, Jesus can come along and that you've committed adultery even if you look lustfully at another woman who's not your wife. Jesus is going to strike to the heart of the law. And that brings to mind our gospel reading, actually in the lectionary. I'm not going to read all of it, but in Mark 7, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes had come to Jerusalem, they're going to question Jesus about why his Pharisees do not eating, because they're eating with defiled hands. Jesus is going to respond back that you abandoned the commandment of God for your tradition, and that somehow you've taken God's law and have made it your own human tradition, and you've lost the heart of it. He said, listen to me, all of you. There is nothing outside a person going in can defile, but from what's within the human heart, the evil intentions are the things that come as if to warn us that sometimes we can even take our traditions in God's law and take evil out of them, or at least misguide it. I would offer this thought when we as Americans begin thinking about what truly makes our nation great. I want to offer two thoughts. The first is, are our laws truly just for all of its citizens? And that there seems to be, amongst God's law, or at least the heart of God's law, a universal recognition of what is truly good and right. There are things in this world that are universally true and right and good. And these things usually rest upon the tenets of love and of justice and of peace and of mercy and of compassion, the very heart of the things that Jesus was talking about. And so when we begin creating laws for our country, when we find out what makes our country great, I would push you to think about the laws and the ordinances we have that cause others, even on the outside, to recognize their goodness, their justness, and how well that they actually care for our citizens. And that good laws, good ordinances are built upon these universal principles. The second thing I wanted to bring up was this, that in this debate about public schools and putting the 10 Commandments on the walls, and somehow some effort, as it reads in Deuteronomy, to make them known to our children and our children's children. Let's be honest, friends. How many times are you actually influenced by a poster on a wall? How many times have you actually been motivated by a motivational poster on the wall? There's a recently fascinating study done by NPR that says that Gen Zers today are more disinterested in school than any previous generation. And I took some qualms with that because I was pretty disinterested in school. Because we had a lot of motivational posters on the wall that just weren't doing the job. But the study showed that due to all of the social media and new digital things that are pulling attention away from our students, that it is harder for them to engage in school. But a really fascinating thing that the study found is what the kids that were doing well, what was helping them, or the kids that said that they were engaged in school, and this was tens of thousands of kids all over the country, middle schoolers even, goodness. What was helping them stay engaged in schools? The number one thing that students said that was helping them stay engaged in schools were teachers who cared about them personally. The fact that the teachers were subject matter experts or knew their material wasn't further down on the list like reason number 8 or 9. Because it's a given that if you're a teacher of science or math and those things, that you should know these things. But it's not necessarily a given that the heart of a teacher comes alongside that student and takes an interest in their personal life, how they desire to be taught, how they learn best. And you've got to commend the job that our teachers are doing in our school systems today, and we need to pray for them and encourage them constantly. Especially teachers who are teaching in school districts that are disadvantaged and have been divested from, and that these teachers often show up to our school districts every day under-resourced in order to have to do Herculean efforts in order to get our students ahead and give them shots at a better life. But the number one thing students said about what kept them engaged in schools is teachers who care. And I know that sounds basic. But think of that in terms of God's law. It should be basic that Christians all over the world know God's law. Basic. It's a whole nother thing to have Christians take a personal interest in people's lives and actually live it. Reason number 2, that they would be passionate about it. That teachers are passionate about the subject matters that they teach. Kids are captivated by adults who are passionate about something. Something about putting a poster on a wall. So that is probably the laziest thing that we could possibly do. If we are to transcribe the law of love that God has so stamped on our hearts in order to get it to our kids, but imagine if our kids saw us loving our enemies and praying for those same enemies who may be persecuting us even physically. Imagine if your kids saw you doing that. The law of love that they would see and feel and know that their mother and father and their teachers or their grandparents, their coaches actually lived. Perhaps it would even leave those students to ask such questions. Surely this is a great man or woman who's wise and discerning with people. Or maybe he would even ask the question, what other great person follows laws and ordinances that would pray for someone who even hates them? Things that are universally true. Jesus goes upon the mount to give blessings upon people who were cast aside and usher in and expound upon the law that God established to help us strike to the very heart of it. And I can't help but think that getting to the heart of our laws and truly discerning what is great and what makes the United States great, and having that debate is one of those things that I do think makes us great, and hammering this out. But when we create ordinances and we are heading towards law, and when we push for laws that are better and more just and more loving and are more caring of the people that are within our borders, and take into consideration those outside, that maybe then people begin saying, for what great nation has a God so near to it, as they call as to the Lord our God whenever we call to him. We saw from Solomon just last week in our lectionary readings, who took time as a leader of his country to say, you know what, God, I don't know the right way to go, but I'm praying for wisdom from you to help me rule over the people with the authority that you had given me, because none of this that you have given me comes from me. And what is going to make me great as a leader and us great as a country when we follow your law of love? These are the things that Jesus points to that truly make people and a country great. And frankly, I just don't think it is putting a poster on a wall and hoping some kid reads it. It is when we actually live God's law of love in front of them and with them to pass it off to them. So friends, with all of those thoughts, I ask and pray that we can continue to live out God's love in our world, both today and every day. And in his great name, may you go in peace, and I'll see you back here next week. Have a great week.